Maya was a bright, hardworking student at her high school, known for her positive attitude and passion for helping others. She was on her way to school one chilly autumn morning, her backpack bouncing lightly on her back as she rushed to catch the bus. She had a big test that day and was determined to do her best. As she stepped onto the school grounds, she was greeted by her friends, laughing and chatting with them as they made their way to the classrooms. Unbeknownst to her, this ordinary day was about to take a turn that would change her life forever. As she walked past the school's parking lot, a police officer, Officer Matthews, approached her. Maya didn't recognize him, but she had seen him around the school a few times. Officer Matthews was a tall man with a stern expression, and while he had always seemed a bit serious, Maya had never thought much of it. She continued walking, unaware of the trouble that was brewing. Without warning, Officer Matthews stopped her. His voice was sharp as he demanded that Maya explain why she was near the staff parking lot. Confused, Maya tried to explain that she was simply walking to her class and had no idea why he was stopping her. "You're not supposed to be here," Officer Matthews insisted, his tone unyielding. Maya felt her heart start to race. She didn't understand what was happening, and before she could say anything else, the officer told her she was being arrested. At first, Maya thought it was a joke. She had never been in trouble at school before, let alone been arrested by a police officer. But Officer Matthews wasn't smiling, and his grip on her arm was tight. He repeated his orders, telling her to put her hands behind her back. Maya's mind raced, and she struggled to understand why this was happening. She hadn't done anything wrong. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene, but everyone seemed to be too afraid or too shocked to help. Maya's thoughts then flashed to her mother. Angela, her mom, had just been elected as the new mayor of the city, a position that came with great responsibility and expectations. Angela had always taught her to stand up for what was right and never let anyone make her feel small or less than anyone else. But now Maya was standing in front of a police officer who had no reason to treat her this way, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. As Officer Matthews continued to hold her, Maya's fear began to grow. She started to wonder if the reason for his treatment had nothing to do with what she had done or not done. Was this really just a misunderstanding, or was there something more behind it? Something deeper, something that made her question whether the color of her skin was playing a part in the way she was being treated. She had heard stories from other people about unfair treatment, but she never thought it would happen to her. Maya stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just any ordinary arrest. This was something that went beyond a simple mistake. It felt like an attack, a reminder of the harsh reality of prejudice. She was still in shock as Officer Matthews led her toward the police car, the world around her suddenly feeling cold and distant. She couldn't believe it. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not today. Angela was at her desk in her office, reviewing a stack of papers related to city policies when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost too quick to understand. But the words were clear. "Mayor, your daughter has been arrested at school." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Angela's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Maya, her daughter, her only child, arrested, in school. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she asked for more details. The caller explained that Maya had been stopped by a police officer on school grounds, and despite her confusion, the officer had decided to arrest her. Angela couldn't believe it. This was her daughter, a bright student with a reputation for being polite and respectful. How could this happen? Angela's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She immediately grabbed her coat, preparing to leave her office. The weight of the situation started to settle in. As the new mayor of the city, her role was more than just a title. She had promised to make a real difference, to fight for equality, justice, and fairness. But this wasn't just a random arrest. Something was deeply wrong, and she could feel the anger rising in her chest. Why would a police officer arrest her daughter without cause? What was going on here? As Angela hurried to her car, Her mind swirled with questions. The woman who had spent her entire career fighting for the rights of others was now faced with the most personal battle of her life. It was one thing to speak out about inequality and injustice, but when it came to her own child, everything felt different. She loved Maya more than anything, and the thought of her daughter being treated this way made her stomach turn. Angela arrived at the school in record time, her heart pounding in her chest. She was still trying to make sense of what had happened as she walked through the school's doors, her eyes scanning the halls for answers. The school principal, Mr. Thompson, was waiting for her in his office, looking just as worried as she felt. "Mayor, I'm so sorry," he began, but Angela didn't want to hear any apologies. She needed facts, and she needed them now. The principal explained that the arrest had taken place just a short while ago, and that Maya had been taken by Officer Matthews, a policeman the school had worked with for years. Angela listened carefully, but the more she heard, the more frustrated she became. It was clear that this had nothing to do with anything Maya had done or hadn't done. Officer Matthews had acted on his own, and from what Angela could gather, it was an action based on something far more sinister: racial prejudice. Angela's face hardened. She had faced countless battles in her life, but this one felt personal. Her daughter had been treated unfairly, and now it was her responsibility to stand up for her, not just as a mother, but as the mayor of the city. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. There would be time to sort through the details later. For now, her focus was on one thing: getting Maya released and making sure this kind of injustice never happened again. With determination in her eyes, Angela picked up her phone and called the police station. It was time to take action. News of Maya's arrest spread quickly through the school, and soon the entire community was buzzing with the shocking details. People were divided. Some were outraged, demanding answers, while others seemed to dismiss the situation as a simple misunderstanding. But for Maya's family and close friends, it was much more than that. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about something much bigger, something that had been lurking under the surface for far too long. As word spread, protests began to form. A small group of students gathered outside the school, holding signs that read "Justice for Maya" and "End Racism Now." Their voices were loud, and their anger was palpable. Maya's friends, who knew her as kind and intelligent, couldn't understand why this had happened to her. They had seen her stand up for others, help classmates, and always try to make the school a better place. How could this happen to someone like her? On the other side of town, some people were quick to defend Officer Matthews. They believed the arrest had been justified, that there had to be something Maya had done to provoke the officer. These voices were louder than ever, calling for an investigation into the matter but supporting the policeman's actions. This division created a tense atmosphere in the city. The very same city that had once prided itself on its diversity now found itself on the edge of a racial divide. As Maya sat at home, she could feel the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She wanted to be brave, to stand strong in the face of all this attention, but the pressure was overwhelming. Her mother's new position as mayor made things even more complicated. People were watching, waiting to see how Angela would handle this. They wanted her to take action, to make bold moves, to show that she would fight for the community. But the weight of it all was heavy. Angela's role as a public leader and a mother was now at odds. She had to be strong for her daughter, but it was difficult to balance the demands of both roles. Maya's friends came over to support her, but she wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, she was grateful for their kindness. On the other, she felt like a symbol, a representative of something much bigger than just her. She didn't want to be seen as just a victim of injustice. She wanted to be heard, to tell her side of the story, to make people understand that she was not the problem here. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had to speak out, not just for herself, but for others who had been treated unfairly. Her mother, Angela, was torn. She knew she had to be there for her daughter, to show support, But she also knew that the fight for justice couldn't wait. As a public figure, her actions would be scrutinized by everyone. Friends, enemies, and everyone in between. Angela couldn't afford to make mistakes, not with so much at stake. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just a political issue. It was a personal one. Her daughter was hurting, and she needed her mother now more than ever. As protests grew in number and intensity, Angela knew the time for silence had passed. She couldn't let this go on any longer. Not while her daughter was suffering, and not while the community was divided. Something had to change. Something had to give. And Angela, as the mayor, was in the perfect position to make sure that change happened. But would it be enough to heal the wounds that had been opened? Only time would tell. Angela sat at her desk, her fingers drumming lightly on the surface, her thoughts racing. The situation had become more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The community, once united in their diversity and shared values, was now split right down the middle. The protests outside were growing larger, and tensions were rising. Every move Angela made would be scrutinized. She knew that as the mayor, she couldn't afford to make any wrong decisions. But as a mother, her priority was clear: protect her daughter and seek justice for what had happened. She called for an emergency meeting with her closest advisors. The room was filled with tension as everyone waited for her to speak. Angela stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces around her. Some looked worried, others were determined, but all of them were waiting for her to take charge. She took a deep breath before addressing them. "We need to launch a full investigation into what happened to Maya," she said, her voice steady. "This wasn't just an isolated incident. We're looking at a larger issue here, one that goes beyond my daughter and beyond the police force." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. Angela knew that the investigation wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about one police officer's actions. It was about uncovering whether this kind of behavior was part of a bigger pattern, something that had been overlooked for far too long. "We need to gather all the facts," Angela continued, her eyes narrowing in determination. "I'm not going to let this be swept under the rug. We owe it to Maya, and we owe it to the community to get to the truth." Her advisors nodded, understanding the stakes. They knew that if Angela was going to take on this fight, they would need to stand behind her. The mayor was no stranger to tough battles. But this one was different. This was personal. As the meeting wrapped up, Angela walked out of the room with a sense of purpose. She needed to make a public statement, but she wanted to be sure that she had all the information before she did. She knew that jumping to conclusions without a clear understanding of the situation could make things worse. But she also knew that waiting too long could cost her the trust of the very people she had promised to protect. Maya, still reeling from the shock of the arrest, had reluctantly agreed to speak to a local reporter. Angela had encouraged her to share her side of the story, but Maya wasn't sure she was ready. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, especially not in a situation like this, but her mother had convinced her that her voice mattered, more than ever before. When Maya sat down with the reporter, she struggled to find the words. The events of the morning still felt like a blur. She had been taken by surprise, confused and frightened. But now, as she spoke, she began to realize that her experience wasn't just her own. It was part of something much larger. "I didn't do anything wrong," Maya said softly, her voice shaking at first. "I was just walking to class. I didn't even know why he stopped me. I don't understand why this happened." The reporter listened intently, nodding in understanding as Maya continued to share her story. As the interview progressed, Maya found her confidence growing. She wasn't just telling her story for herself anymore. She was telling it for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. As the day wore on, Angela began to realize just how much support her family had. Messages of support poured in from every corner of the city. Many people, including some of the school's staff, expressed their disbelief over what had happened to Maya. They, too, wanted to see justice served. But others, people she had trusted in the past, began to voice their doubts. Some questioned whether the arrest was justified. Others tried to deflect attention away from the deeper issues at hand. But Angela refused to back down. She knew that standing up for her daughter was the right thing to do. She also knew that the city was watching her closely. It was a delicate balance. She had to fight for what was right without losing the support of those who felt differently. But one thing was clear. She wouldn't let this go unanswered. Maya deserved justice, and so did the rest of the city. As the days passed, the city was filled with tension and uncertainty. The media had picked up the story, and the situation was now on everyone's radar. News outlets from across the state arrived to cover the unfolding events. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust in front of anyone willing to speak. Angela had become the focus of public attention, and the weight of her position as mayor felt heavier than ever. While the protests continued outside the school, the calls for action became louder. People were demanding that Officer Matthews be held accountable, while others were questioning the mayor's leadership. Some criticized Angela for turning what seemed like a simple mistake into a larger issue, while others praised her for standing up for her daughter and for justice. The division in the city had never been so apparent, and Angela could feel the strain of it pulling at her. At home, Maya was struggling with the pressure. She had never been one to seek attention, but now, with reporters camped outside her house and strangers stopping her in the street, she couldn't escape the public eye. The constant questions, the stares, the whispers, it was all too much. She just wanted things to go back to normal. But normal didn't feel possible anymore. Maya's friends rallied around her, offering support and comfort, but even their well-meaning words didn't ease the discomfort that had settled in her chest. She found herself questioning everything: the arrest, the officer's treatment, and even how she was seen by the people around her. The fear that had gripped her on the day of the incident hadn't fully gone away. It still lingered, like a shadow that followed her everywhere she went. Angela, too, felt the strain of the situation. The pressure to do the right thing weighed heavily on her every decision. She couldn't let her emotions get in the way of her duties as mayor, but she also couldn't ignore what was happening to her daughter. She needed to find a way to balance both, the personal and the professional. This wasn't just a matter of political strategy. It was about her family, her values, and the future of the city she had worked so hard to lead. One afternoon, Angela called a press conference. She had been preparing for this moment for days, carefully considering every word she would say. The pressure was immense, but Angela knew that this was her chance to speak directly to the public, to take control of the narrative. She stepped up to the podium, looking out at the sea of reporters and cameras in front of her. "I know that many of you are concerned about what happened to my daughter, Maya," Angela began, her voice steady but firm. "I want to make it clear that I will not stand by and let this incident go unanswered. What happened to her is not just a personal matter. It's a reflection of deeper issues that we, as a community, must face." Angela's words were measured, but the message was clear. She was not backing down. She was not going to let her daughter's experience be minimized. The crowd listened in silence as she continued. "We need to ensure that every person in this city, regardless of their race or background, feels safe and respected. This isn't just about one police officer. This is about the systems we've created, the structures that allow for prejudice and discrimination to persist. It's time for us to take a hard look at ourselves and decide what kind of community we want to be." Her speech was met with a mix of applause and skepticism. Some cheered in support, while others remained unsure, their arms crossed and their expressions guarded. But Angela wasn't looking for universal approval. She was looking for change. The days that followed were filled with meetings, discussions, and planning. Angela worked tirelessly, meeting with community leaders, law enforcement, and city officials to determine how to address the issues at hand. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but Angela was determined to take action. Meanwhile, Maya's voice became stronger. The more she spoke about what had happened, the more she realized that her story was part of something much bigger than herself. She wasn't just speaking for her own experience. She was speaking for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for those who had been silenced for too long. She felt a sense of responsibility now, not just to her community, but to herself. As the city held its breath, waiting for the next step, Angela knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be opposition. There would be setbacks, but one thing was certain. She was ready to fight for justice, for her daughter, and for the future of the city. The journey had only just begun, but Angela was prepared to lead it, no matter where it took her. The press conference had set the stage for a wave of changes, but Angela knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. There were still many people who doubted the severity of what had happened to Maya, and even more who felt that things had been blown out of proportion. The community, divided and tense, was looking for a sign that the mayor would lead them through this storm. Angela understood the weight of her responsibility and knew that it was time to take decisive action. That evening, after the press conference, Angela called for a meeting with the police department's internal affairs team. She couldn't afford to wait for things to sort themselves out. The first step was to address the incident with Officer Matthews head-on. She needed to ensure that there would be a thorough investigation into the officer's actions, and that everyone, from the police force to the public, knew that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. She entered the meeting with a sense of determination that couldn't be shaken. As the officers in the room shifted in their seats, Angela stood tall. "We have a responsibility to the people of this city," she said, her voice calm yet filled with authority. "And that responsibility includes making sure that every citizen, regardless of their race or background, feels safe when interacting with law enforcement. We must set an example of fairness, of justice, and of equality. This investigation needs to be swift, thorough, and transparent." The officers around the table nodded, but Angela could tell they were still processing the full impact of what she was asking. They were used to routine, to standard procedures. But this was different. This was personal for the community and for her family. She couldn't afford to have it swept under the rug. The investigation into Officer Matthews needed to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for some. "I expect a detailed report within the next week," Angela continued, "and I want the public to have access to the findings as soon as possible. There will be no hiding from this. We need to show the people that we are serious about rooting out the kind of behavior that puts them at risk." As the meeting concluded, Angela felt a sense of relief, knowing that the first step had been taken. But this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead. She knew that Officer Matthews was well connected in some circles, and there would be those who tried to defend him. But Angela had made up her mind. She wasn't going to back down. Meanwhile, Maya, though still struggling with the attention, began to feel a sense of strength growing inside her. At school, she had become something of a symbol, not just of injustice, but of hope for change. More and more students, some of whom had barely spoken to her before, came forward to offer their support. They stood by her side, signing petitions, raising awareness, and organizing rallies. Maya never wanted to be a symbol. She never asked for this attention. But now she realized that her story had the power to inspire. The next few days were a blur of meetings and phone calls for Angela. She balanced the demands of running the city with the need to stay close to Maya. At night, she would sit by her daughter's side, offering comfort and guidance, reminding her that things would get better. But even as she reassured Maya, Angela knew that the fight was far from over. One afternoon, Maya came to her with something unexpected. "I want to talk to Officer Matthews," she said, her voice steady, though Angela could sense the nervousness beneath it. Maya had spent days grappling with her emotions, feeling both angry and confused by the way she had been treated. She knew that talking to the officer might bring up difficult feelings, but she also knew that she needed to understand why it had happened. Angela looked at her daughter, proud of her courage. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. Maya nodded. "I need answers. I need to understand why he did what he did." Angela, though worried about the emotional toll it might take on her daughter, knew that this was an important step. "Okay," she said softly. I'll help you. We'll do it together. The decision to speak with Officer Matthews was a powerful one. It wasn't just about confronting him. It was about Maya taking control of her own story, about finding her voice in the middle of the storm. It was a decision that would ultimately shape not only her future but the future of their city as well. As Angela prepared for the meeting, she could sense a shift in the atmosphere around her. The investigation was moving forward, but now it was about more than just justice for Maya. It was about making sure that the community understood that this was a moment for growth and change. It was a chance to heal, to learn from the past, and to work together toward a better, more inclusive future. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with them. As the days went by, Angela and Maya continued to navigate the storm of public attention. The tension in the city remained high, but Angela could feel a change starting to take place. It wasn't just about her leadership as mayor anymore. It was about showing the community that things could be different. That change was possible if they all worked together. Maya's decision to speak with Officer Matthews had been one of the hardest, yet most important, choices she had ever made. Angela was proud of her daughter's bravery, but she also understood the emotional toll it would take. Maya wasn't just confronting the officer. She was confronting the very system that had allowed such an injustice to happen in the first place. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about something larger, something that affected everyone. When the day arrived for Maya and Angela to meet with Officer Matthews, there was an air of uncertainty hanging over them. It wasn't just the pressure of the investigation, but the weight of their emotions that made this moment so significant. Angela had been by Maya's side every step of the way, but she knew this would be a pivotal moment for both of them. Officer Matthews had been informed of their request to meet, and when he arrived at the designated meeting room, he seemed uncomfortable. He had never imagined that Maya, whom he had seen as just another student, would be standing in front of him, determined to have a conversation about what had happened. He looked at Maya, his face unreadable, and then turned to Angela for guidance. Maya, though nervous, held her ground. She had prepared herself for this conversation, and she was determined to get the answers she deserved. "Why did you stop me?" she asked, her voice steady, but filled with a mix of curiosity and emotion. "What did I do wrong?" For a moment, Officer Matthews seemed hesitant. He shifted in his seat and sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I saw something suspicious," he began, his voice low. "But I made a mistake. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Maya nodded slowly, trying to make sense of his words. "You scared me," she said softly. "I didn't understand why you arrested me. I didn't feel safe." The officer's face softened. He seemed to regret his actions, but at the same time, his words seemed hollow. Maya could tell that he wasn't fully grasping the deeper impact of what he had done. He had made a snap judgment based on something other than facts, and in that moment, Maya realized that the officer's actions weren't just about her. They were about a mindset that needed to change. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Officer Matthews said quietly, "but I see now that my actions were wrong." Maya looked at him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to think that he truly understood the harm he had caused, but she knew that his apology wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and words alone wouldn't fix everything. Angela watched the conversation unfold with a quiet intensity. She had always taught Maya to seek understanding, to be patient with others, but she also knew that there was a limit to how much someone could learn without real consequences. "We can't just move on from this," Angela said, her voice calm but firm. "You may have made a mistake, but it was a mistake that needs to be addressed. The city needs to see accountability." Maya, though still processing her feelings, nodded in agreement. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did. It's not just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The officer's face fell, and for the first time, it seemed like he was truly listening. Maya's words had broken through the defensive walls he had built, and though he didn't have all the answers, He seemed to understand that something had to change. As the meeting came to a close, there was no dramatic resolution. There was no immediate sense of closure. But for Maya, this was the beginning of something important. She had taken control of her narrative, and in doing so, she had shown not just Officer Matthews, but the entire community that silence wasn't an option. She had spoken out, and she had made a difference. Angela was proud of her daughter, but she also knew that this moment wasn't the end. It was just one step in a much larger journey. The investigation into Officer Matthews would. As the days passed and the investigation progressed, the city began to slowly heal. There were still debates, still differences of opinion, but there was also a growing sense that things could be better. That change, though difficult and uncomfortable, was possible, and with Maya's courage and Angela's leadership, the city began to move toward a more just and inclusive future, one where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and respected. The days following the meeting with Officer Matthews were a blur of emotions for both Maya and Angela. Though the conversation had been tough, it felt like a turning point, a moment where things had shifted. For Maya, it wasn't just about understanding the officer's point of view. It was about finding her own voice and realizing that she had the power to speak out, to stand up for what was right. Angela, too, felt the weight of the change. She had been fighting for justice and equality for years, but this was different. This was personal. This was her daughter. The pressure to protect her, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again, had weighed heavily on her. But now, as a mother and a leader, she felt more determined than ever. The journey they had been on was far from over, but it was beginning to take shape. As the investigation into Officer Matthews continued, it became clear that there were larger issues within the department that needed to be addressed. Angela was resolute in her commitment to bring about meaningful change. She called for community meetings, inviting people from all walks of life to come forward, to share their stories, and to discuss how the city could move forward together. The meetings were emotional and difficult, but they were also filled with hope. People who had once felt unheard, marginalized, and invisible began to speak up. They shared their own experiences of discrimination, of fear, of being judged based on the color of their skin, their background, or their appearance. It was a hard truth to face, but it was a truth that had to be acknowledged. Angela listened to each and every person who spoke, offering words of encouragement and promising that their voices would be heard. At the same time, Officer Matthews faced the consequences of his actions. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that went beyond that single incident with Maya. Though he was removed from his position, it was clear that this wasn't a matter of just firing one person. It was about addressing the systemic issues that allowed prejudice to go unchecked, that allowed racial bias to influence decisions made by those in power. The city began to take steps to reform the police department, to provide better training on handling discrimination, and to ensure that everyone, no matter their race, was treated with fairness and respect. The changes were not immediate. There was resistance, and there were setbacks. Some people in the community still didn't fully understand why these changes were necessary. They didn't see the problem, or they thought it wasn't a big deal. But as more conversations were had, as more people came forward, it became impossible to ignore. The city started to slowly but surely shift. The conversations Angela had been hoping for were happening, and they were changing the way people thought about race, justice, and equality. For Maya, the journey was not easy. She still faced moments of doubt and fear. She had learned that standing up for what was right often came with a heavy cost. But she had also learned that her voice mattered. She wasn't just the victim of an injustice. She was a catalyst for change. She spoke at schools, at rallies, and in front of crowds, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out. She became a role model, not just for her peers, but for people all over the city who saw in her the courage to make a difference. Angela watched her daughter grow stronger every day. She had always known that Maya was resilient, but seeing her step into her own power filled her with pride. Together, They had faced something that most people would have been too afraid to confront. Together, they had turned a painful moment into a source of strength for their entire city. The impact of their journey was far-reaching. Though the road to change was long, the community had begun to heal. People who had once felt silenced and ignored now knew that they had a place at the table. They knew that their voices mattered. They knew that they could make a difference. And as Maya and Angela stood together, looking out over the city they both loved, they knew that the fight was far from over. There would be more battles, more challenges, and more hard work ahead. But they also knew that change was possible. With determination, courage, and unity, they had begun to build something better. Something that would last. Something that would make their city a place where everyone, no matter who they were, could feel safe, respected, and valued.